The Grand Assembly Hall was the largest structure ever built by any civilization in the known galaxy. It floated in orbit around the neutral world of Prime, and inside its curved walls sat representatives from 47 spacefaring species. Today they had gathered to pass judgment on humanity. Ambassador Daniel stood alone in the center of the chamber. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes, and he had spent 20 years of his life building bridges between Earth and the stars. Now he watched those bridges burn. The representative was speaking, his scaled face twisted with false concern as he presented evidence of human crimes against the sacred accords. The evidence was lies. Daniel knew it, and he suspected many others in the chamber knew it too. But the Dominion had ruled this council for 3,000 years, and few species dared to challenge them openly. Humanity had been a member for only 60 years, the youngest species ever admitted, and they had grown too fast for comfort. Lieutenant Corinne Mills stood behind Daniel, her hands clenched at her sides. She was his aide and translator, barely 30 years old, and she had believed in the promise of galactic cooperation. Now she watched that promise die. The representative finished his presentation and called for a vote. Daniel stepped forward to speak. He presented counter-evidence, showed the flaws in claims, and reminded the assembly of everything humanity had contributed in their short membership. Medical advances shared freely with all species. Emergency aid sent to disaster zones without asking for payment. Young humans serving on joint exploration missions, dying alongside alien in the pursuit of knowledge. The chamber was silent when he finished. Then the voting began. 31 species voted for exile. 16 voted against. Humanity was stripped of all trade agreements, forbidden from entering Council space, and their colonial worlds within Council territory were seized. 2 million human colonists would be forced from their homes. 60 years of progress would be erased in a single day. Corinne felt tears running down her face as the verdict was announced. Daniel simply stood there, his expression empty. He had given everything to this alliance, and now it had thrown his people away like garbage. A guard approached to escort them from the chamber. High Counselor watched from his elevated seat as the humans were led away. He was old even by standards, his scales faded to pale gray, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence and cruelty. His aide leaned close and asked if the plan had worked. Allowed himself a small smile. The plan had worked perfectly. Humanity had been growing too powerful, too influential, too quickly. Other species were starting to look to them for leadership instead of that could not be allowed. The fabricated evidence had done its job, and now the human threat would be removed forever. Far across the galaxy, Admiral Cole received the news aboard the carrier Endurance. He was a soldier who had served humanity for 40 years, and he had fought pirates, rescued colonists, and explored unknown regions of space. But he had never faced anything like this. His orders were clear. Evacuate all human colonists from seized worlds. Withdraw all human vessels from Council space. Do not engage Council forces under any circumstances. Gathered his senior officers and explained the situation. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to negotiate. Silenced them all with a look. They would follow orders because that was what soldiers did. But he made them a promise. This was not the end. Humanity had faced extinction before on their own world, and they had survived. They would survive this too. The evacuation took 3 months. 2 million people packed onto overcrowded ships, leaving behind homes they had built with their own hands. Families carried whatever they could. Children cried for pets they had to abandon. Old people wept for gardens they would never see again. And through it all, the Council species watched in silence, none willing to speak against the injustice they witnessed. Corinne Mills worked tirelessly during the evacuation, helping families find space on departing ships, translating for confused colonists, holding the hands of those too sick to walk. She had lost her faith in the galactic community, but she had found something else: pride in her own people. Humans did not abandon each other. When one suffered, all suffered together. Daniel remained on Prime until the last human ship departed Council space. He stood at the viewport of a small transport, watching the border markers fall away behind them. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness beyond Council territory, his people would have to build a new home. He did not know if they could do it, but he knew they would try. The outer reach was what the Council called the unexplored regions beyond their borders. It was a place of dead worlds, unstable stars, and cosmic hazards that made travel dangerous. No Council species had ever bothered to explore it properly because there seemed to be nothing of value there. Now it would become humanity's new home. Admiral Cole led the refugee fleet into the darkness. Behind them, the lights of Council space faded to nothing. Ahead of them, unknown dangers waited, but also unknown possibilities. Cole addressed the fleet over open channels, his voice steady and calm. He told them that the Council had cast them out expecting them to die. He said their enemies believed that humans could not survive without the support of more advanced civilizations. He promised that they would prove those enemies wrong, not through war or revenge, but through something better. They would build a civilization that the galaxy had never seen, one based on freedom, equality, and the unbreakable spirit of humanity. Back on Prime, High Counselor celebrated his victory with his closest advisors. One of them asked how long it would take for the humans to collapse, considered the question carefully. He estimated 3 generations at most. Without access to Council technology and trade, the humans would slowly decline. Their ships would break down. Their colonies would fail. Eventually, the survivors would come crawling back, begging for scraps at Council borders. His aide asked what they should do when that happened, laughed coldly. He said they would do nothing. They would let the humans starve as a lesson to any other species that dared to rise too quickly. The galaxy belonged to and it always would. In the darkness of the outer reach, 2 million humans looked up at unfamiliar stars and wondered what tomorrow would bring. They did not know it yet, but tomorrow would bring something incredible, something that would change the galaxy forever. 15 years had passed since the exile, and the colony of New Providence had become the heart of human civilization in the outer reach. It was built on a harsh world with thin air and cold temperatures, but humans had learned to thrive in harsh conditions long before they reached the stars. Governor Torres stood on the balcony of the administration building and watched the sun set over fields of engineered crops that should not have been able to grow here. Had been a young agricultural scientist when the exile happened. Now she led a colony of 300,000 people, and she carried the weight of their survival on her shoulders every day. Resources were always tight. Equipment broke down constantly, and every few months someone would ask when they could go home. She never had an answer for that question. But there was hope too. Without the Council's technology restrictions, human scientists had been free to experiment in ways they never could before. Dr. Samuel led a research team that had just made an incredible breakthrough. They had discovered a new form of faster-than-light travel using quantum tunneling principles that the Council had forbidden humanity from studying. The new drive was 3 times faster than anything the Council possessed. Samuel presented his findings to a gathering of colony leaders in a cramped conference room. Admiral Cole was there, older now but still sharp. Ambassador Daniel had come from his diplomatic station in neutral space, and young Maya Porter sat in the back, a brilliant engineer barely 25 years old who had been working on the project since she was a teenager. The implications were staggering. With this new drive, humans could explore the outer reach faster than anyone had thought possible. They could find new worlds, new resources, and maybe even new allies. Cole immediately began planning exploration missions, started thinking about which neutral species might be interested in trade, but Maya was thinking about something else entirely. 3 months later, Captain Shaw led a mining expedition to a dead world on the edge of explored space. His crew was searching for rare minerals when they found something that changed everything. Buried beneath the surface was a vast complex of ancient structures, perfectly preserved despite being millions of years old. The technology inside was beyond anything humans had ever seen. Shaw reported his discovery immediately. Maya Porter was on the next ship out, leading a team of scientists and engineers to study the ruins. What they found was the legacy of a species the Council had only whispered about in legends. The architects had been the most advanced civilization in galactic history. They had disappeared millions of years ago, and no one knew why. But they had left things behind. Maya spent weeks studying the architect data crystals, learning their language, understanding their technology. And then she discovered something that made her heart stop. The architects had built a network of facilities throughout the outer reach. Shipyards, research stations, manufacturing plants, all lying dormant and waiting to be activated. But they could only be activated by someone with specific genetic markers. By pure random chance, human DNA was compatible. She tested the activation sequence on a small device first. It worked. Then she tried a larger system. That worked too. Finally, standing in the control center of an architect shipyard capable of building vessels that would make Council warships look like toys, she sent a message to Governor Torres. 3 words: "We found something." While Maya unlocked the secrets of the architects, Admiral Cole was building alliances. The outer reach was not as empty as the Council believed. Other species lived here, some of them exiled like humanity, others who had simply never wanted to join the Council's rigid hierarchy. They were the most important. They had been expelled from Council space 800 years ago for refusing to bow to demands. They were a proud warrior species with a strong sense of honor, and they had survived in the outer reach through sheer determination. When Cole approached them about an alliance, their leader was suspicious at first. Humans were young and untested. What could they offer? Cole showed them the new quantum drive technology. He showed them plans for weapons systems that human engineers had developed without Council restrictions. And he told them about Maya's discovery. The leader listened carefully, and then he smiled for the first time in the meeting. He said that they had made a terrible mistake exiling humanity. Cole agreed completely. The alliance was signed within a month. They would provide soldiers and resources. Humanity would provide technology and innovation. Together, they would build something that neither could build alone. Other species began approaching them too. Word spread through the outer reach that the humans were rising, and those who had been forgotten by the Council wanted to rise with them. Back on New Providence, Governor Torres watched the transformation with quiet amazement. New ships were launching every week, built with architect technology and human creativity. Colonies were spreading to worlds that had once seemed impossible to settle. The population was growing as humans had children without fear of restrictions. And for the first time since the exile, people were talking about the future with hope instead of despair. Daniel established a diplomatic station on a neutral asteroid, and representatives from a dozen non-council species came to meet with him. They wanted trade agreements, technology sharing, mutual defense pacts. Humanity was no longer a desperate group of refugees. They were becoming a power. Maya Porter stood in the completed architect shipyard and watched the first human-designed, architect-built warship roll off the production line. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. She thought about the council that had cast her people out, expecting them to die. She thought about the who had lied and cheated to make it happen, and she wondered what they would think when they saw what humanity had become. Admiral Cole came to stand beside her. He was 70 years old now, and he knew he would not live to see everything that humanity would accomplish. But he had seen enough. He had seen his people fall to their lowest point, and he had seen them begin to rise again. He put a hand on Maya's shoulder and told her that she had done something incredible. Maya shook her head. She said that she had not done anything alone. Every human in the outer reach had contributed to this moment. Every sacrifice, every struggle, every small victory had led them here. This was not the achievement of one person. It was the achievement of an entire species that had refused to accept extinction. 15 years after being cast out in disgrace, humanity was ready to show the galaxy what they had become. 30 years after the exile, the United Human Territories stretched across 30 star systems. President Grant stood before a crowd of millions on the capital world of New Terra, delivering a speech that was broadcast to every human colony and allied world in their growing domain. He reminded them of what they had been: refugees, outcasts, people who were expected to die in the darkness, and he showed them what they had become: a civilization stronger than anything the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years. The crowd cheered until the ground shook. Children who had been born after the exile, who had never known council space, waved flags bearing the symbol of united humanity. Veterans who had survived the early years wept openly. And watching from the presidential residence, Admiral Cole felt pride fill his ancient heart. He was 90 years old now, his body failing, but his mind was still sharp. He had lived to see his people rise from nothing to greatness. The military had transformed completely. Commander Fisher led the first battle group on patrol along the border with Council space, commanding ships that combined architect technology with human innovation. Her crew was a mix of humans and allied species, working together with an efficiency that Council forces could never match. They were not looking for trouble, but they were ready for it. Trade had become humanity's greatest weapon. Merchant Captain Pete ran supplies to worlds the Council had abandoned, bringing medicine, food, and technology to species that the had deemed worthless. He asked for nothing in return except friendship. And friendship, he had learned, was worth more than gold. Every world he helped became a friend of humanity. Every species he aided remembered who had come to them in their time of need. The Council had begun to notice. For decades they had ignored the outer reach, confident that the exiled humans were slowly dying. Now their scouts reported something impossible: a thriving civilization with technology that matched or exceeded their own, warships that could destroy Council vessels in seconds, trade networks that stretched across regions the Council had never bothered to explore. They were particularly alarmed. Counselor of the had always opposed the exile. His species had voted against it, and he had spent 30 years watching the Council decline under leadership. Now he saw an opportunity. He secretly contacted Ambassador Daniel, who still operated from his diplomatic station in neutral space, and arranged a meeting. The meeting took place on a small moon far from any major trade routes. Came alone, risking his position and possibly his life to deliver a warning. They were planning a preemptive strike against humanity. They had convinced a coalition of allied species to join them, promising easy victory against what they still called primitive exiles. The attack would come within 2 years. Daniel thanked him for the warning and asked why he was taking such a risk, was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said that the Council had become corrupt under rule. Species were oppressed, progress was restricted, and anyone who challenged the established order was destroyed. He had hoped for years that someone would rise up and change things. Now he believed that someone might be humanity. The warning was transmitted to New Terra immediately. President Grant called an emergency meeting of his military and diplomatic advisors. Admiral Cole attended despite his failing health, and Commander Fisher was recalled from patrol. Maya Porter, now Chief Science Advisor, presented detailed analysis of Council military capabilities. The conclusion was clear: humanity could win this war. But Cole cautioned against overconfidence. They had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years because they were cunning and ruthless. They would not attack unless they believed they could win. Something was wrong with their calculations, and humanity needed to find out what it was before the fighting started. The answer came 3 months later when a scout fleet crossed into human space. 12 warships, testing the defenses, probing for weaknesses. Commander Fisher intercepted them with her battle group in the outer system of a minor colony world. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. Every vessel was destroyed. Human losses were 0. Fisher reviewed the battle data with growing concern. The ships had been using tactics that were centuries out of date. Their weapons were inferior, their shields were weak, and their crews seemed almost incompetent. Either they had declined dramatically since the exile, or this was some kind of trap. She reported her findings to High Command and recommended extreme caution. High Counselor received the report of the failed scout mission in his private chambers on Prime. His scales had faded to almost white with age, but his cruelty had only grown stronger over the decades. His aide asked if they should delay the invasion, dismissed the suggestion with contempt. The scout fleet had been commanded by fools. The main invasion force would be led by the finest admirals, and it would crush the human vermin once and for all. But doubt had begun to spread through the council. From the coalition, citing diplomatic concerns. 3 other species followed within weeks. They found themselves leading a smaller force than planned but refused to postpone. He had waited 30 years to finish what he started. He would not wait any longer. On New Terra, President Grant addressed his people one final time before the storm. He told them that war was coming, not because humanity sought it, but because some could not accept their rise. He promised that they would defend every colony, protect every citizen, and never surrender to those who had tried to destroy them. And when the war was over, they would build something better than the council had ever been. Admiral Cole watched the speech from his hospital bed. He knew he would not survive to see the end of this conflict, but he had faith in the people he had trained, the officers he had mentored, the civilization he had helped build. Humanity would face its greatest test, and humanity would prevail. He closed his eyes and let himself rest, dreaming of victory. Across the border, 300 warships prepared for invasion. Their commanders boasted of easy conquest. Their crews dreamed of glory and plunder. None of them understood what they were about to face. None of them knew that the species they had exiled had become something far greater than they could imagine. They were about to learn. The invasion began on a cold morning in the New Providence system. 300 warships crossed the border in perfect formation, their commanders confident of swift victory. High Counselor himself watched from the command ship, eager to witness the destruction of the species he had exiled 32 years ago. He expected the battle to last a few hours at most. He was wrong. Admiral Cole had died peacefully in his sleep 3 days before the invasion, but the defense plan he had created lived on, executed by officers he had trained over decades of service. Commander Fisher led the main battle group from her flagship, the Redemption. Captain Tyler Grant, the president's son, commanded a fighter squadron, and throughout the system, hidden weapons platforms activated for the first time. The fleet entered weapons range and opened fire. Their shots splashed harmlessly against human shields. Then the human fleet responded. Energy beams powered by architect technology tore through armor like paper. Missiles designed by human engineers found their targets with perfect accuracy. Within the first 10 minutes, 40 ships were destroyed or disabled. Watched in horror as his fleet was torn apart. He screamed orders at his commanders, demanding they press the attack, but it was hopeless. Human ships moved with speed and coordination that vessels could not match. Fighter squadrons led by Tyler Grant swept through enemy formations, destroying engines and weapon systems with surgical precision. The battle that had expected to win in hours was already lost. The surviving ships fled back across the border, leaving behind 200 wrecked vessels and thousands of dead crew members. Human losses were minimal: 12 ships damaged, 2 destroyed, fewer than 300 casualties. Commander Fisher reported the victory to High Command and requested permission to pursue. President Grant the request. Humanity would defend its territory, but it would not become a conqueror. News of the battle spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Species that had been considering joining the coalition immediately. Others began secretly contacting human diplomats, asking about the possibility of alliance or protection. The council, which had ruled the galaxy suddenly looked weak and outdated, and they looked like fools. back on Prime, faced a council that had lost faith in his leadership. Representatives from dozens of species demanded explanations for the disaster. How had the humans developed such advanced technology? Why had intelligence failed so completely? What was the plan now? Had no answers. For the first time in his long life, he felt true fear. Maya Porter revealed her greatest achievement 1 week after the battle. The Architect Defense Network was fully restored. Automated stations throughout the outer reach had been activated, creating an impenetrable barrier around human space. Any hostile fleet that tried to invade would face weapons systems that made the Battle of New Providence look like a minor skirmish. Humanity was now untouchable. But President Grant was not satisfied with defense alone. He understood that as long as they remained in power, there would be no peace. They would rebuild their fleet, find new allies, and try again. The only way to ensure lasting safety was to remove the threat entirely, not through conquest but through liberation. Human forces began pushing into Council space, but they did not attack civilian targets or seize territory. Instead, they freed worlds that had been oppressed by them for centuries. Species that had been forced to serve interests were given a choice: join the human alliance or remain independent. Either way, they would never be slaves again. The response was overwhelming. Populations that had lived in fear for generations welcomed human ships as liberators. Local resistance movements that had been fighting hopeless battles suddenly found themselves supported by the most powerful military in the galaxy. World after world threw off control and declared allegiance to humanity or independence. The empire that had spent his life building was crumbling. Captain Tyler Grant led the liberation of a world called home to a species that had been brutally oppressed for over 1,000 years. The people had been used as slave labor, their culture destroyed, their population controlled through violence and starvation. When human ships arrived, they did not believe it at first. Freedom was a concept they had forgotten. Tyler walked through the capital city alongside leaders, showing them that the occupation was truly over. Children who had never seen the sky without fear looked up at human soldiers and smiled. Elderly people who remembered the stories of their ancestors wept with joy. Tyler thought about his father, about Admiral Cole, about everyone who had sacrificed to make this moment possible. This was why they had fought. This was why they had survived. Ambassador Daniel met secretly with representatives from 12 council species in a hidden location. They wanted to defect, to join the human alliance and be free of tyranny. Listen to their concerns, their fears, their hopes. He promised them that humanity would treat them as equals, not subjects. There would be no new empire. There would be partnership. The final battle took place above the had gathered every remaining ship in a desperate last stand, but it was hopeless. Human forces surrounded the planet, their weapons capable of destroying everything on the surface. But President Grant did not order an attack. Instead, he opened communication channels and offered terms of surrender. Stood in the ruins of his command center, watching human ships fill the sky. His empire was gone. His allies had abandoned him. His fleet was destroyed. He had spent his entire life believing that they were destined to rule the galaxy forever. Now he understood that destiny was a lie. Power came and went. Empires rose and fell. And those who ruled through cruelty would always be defeated by those who ruled through justice. He called for surrender negotiations. The response from President Grant was simple: unconditional surrender. They would face justice for their crimes, and the galaxy would never again suffer under their rule. Had no choice but to accept. The war was over. Humanity had won. The Grand Assembly Hall on Prime had been rebuilt after the war. The old council symbols were gone, replaced by a simple emblem representing unity among all species. Where 47 representatives had once sat in judgment of humanity, now over 100 species gathered to witness the birth of something new. The age of empires was ending. The age of cooperation was about to begin. President Grant stood at the central podium, looking out at faces from every corner of the galaxy. Some of these species had voted for humanity's exile 35 years ago. Others had fought against them in the recent war, but most were here because they believed in what humanity was offering, a chance to build a better future together. Grant began his speech by acknowledging the past. He spoke of the exile, the years of struggle, the war that had cost so many lives on all sides. He did not minimize the suffering or pretend that old wounds would heal easily, but he offered something that no galactic power had ever offered before: true partnership. Every species, regardless of size or military strength, would have an equal voice in the new assembly. No one would dominate. No one would be silenced. The former leaders of the Dominion were brought before the assembly in restraints. High Counselor stood among them, his scales gray and his eyes empty. For 3,000 years, the had ruled through fear and manipulation. They had exiled entire species, destroyed civilizations, and committed crimes that were only now being fully documented. Justice would be served. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witnesses from dozens of species about atrocities. Evidence was presented showing systematic oppression, forced labor, and calculated genocide. Offered no defense. He simply sat in silence, watching his legacy be destroyed. When the verdict came, it was unanimous: guilty on all charges. The sentence was exile, and the surviving leadership would be transported to a barren world in the outer reaches of the galaxy. They would be given basic supplies and left to survive on their own. It was the same fate they had once imposed on humanity. The chamber was silent as was led away. He did not look back. Admiral Cole had not lived to see this day, but his memory was honored throughout the proceedings. A moment of silence was observed, and his name was spoken with reverence by human and alien voices alike. He had been the steady hand that guided humanity through its darkest hours. He had trained the officers who won the war, and he had never lost faith that his people would rise again. Counselor of the approached the podium after the sentencing. He had risked everything to warn humanity about the invasion, and now he was one of the most respected voices in the new assembly. He spoke about the old council and its failures, how corruption had been allowed to spread, how justice had been to the weak, and how one small act of cruelty, the exile of humanity, had ultimately destroyed the system that committed it. He asked the assembly to remember this lesson. Power without justice would always fail. Empires built on oppression would always crumble. The only lasting civilization was one where all voices were heard and all beings were valued. Then he turned to President Grant and thanked him, on behalf of every species that had suffered under rule, for showing the galaxy a better way. Maya Porter was appointed to lead the Science and Exploration Council, the first human to hold a senior position in the new galactic government. She stood before her staff, a mix of species from across known space, and outlined her vision for the future. The architect technology would be shared with all member worlds. Research that had been forbidden would now be encouraged, and the vast unexplored regions beyond current maps would be opened for discovery. She thought about the young engineer she had been, sitting in the back of a cramped conference room, listening to plans for survival. She thought about the dead world where she had discovered the architect ruins, the moment when everything changed. And she thought about all the people who had believed in her when she did not believe in herself. This was their achievement as much as hers. Captain Tyler Grant took command of the new Joint Defense Fleet, a military force drawn from all member species and dedicated to protecting every world equally. He walked the corridors of his flagship, past human and alien crew members working side by side, and felt hope for the future. His father had taught him that strength was meaningless without purpose. Now humanity's strength would be used to defend the defenseless and protect the peace that so many had died to achieve. Ambassador Daniel finally returned to Earth for the first time in 35 years. The planet had changed during his absence. New cities had risen, old wounds had healed, and a generation had been born that knew nothing of the exile except stories. But some things remained the same. The sky was still blue, the ocean still crashed against the shore, and humanity still called this small world home. He walked through a memorial garden that had been built to honor those who died during the exile and the war. Statues stood among flowering trees, each one representing someone who had sacrificed everything for the survival of their species. Soldiers and scientists, leaders and ordinary citizens, the famous and the forgotten. A young girl approached him, holding her grandfather's hand. She looked up at the statues and asked who these people were. Daniel knelt down to her level and thought about how to explain 35 years of struggle to a child who had never known hardship. He told her that these were the people who refused to give up. When the galaxy cast humanity out, expecting them to die, these people chose to live. When everything seemed hopeless, they found hope. When they had nothing, they built everything. They were not special because they were heroes. They were heroes because they were ordinary people who did extraordinary things when it mattered most. The girl nodded seriously, as if she understood something important. Then she asked if humanity would always be safe now. Daniel smiled and told her that nothing was ever certain, but he believed that as long as people remembered this story, as long as they remembered what humans could accomplish when they stood together, there would always be hope. He stood up and looked out over the memorial garden, the flowers blooming in the warm sunlight. The galaxy had tried to destroy humanity by casting them out. Instead, they had forged themselves into something greater, not conquerors but builders, not tyrants but liberators. The species that had been judged unworthy had created a civilization truly worthy of the stars. And this was only the beginning.